Hello, SPC participants. Appreciate you joining us for the evening. Bailey Abel is on with us from staff, and Miss Abel will be talking to you a little bit later about some of your assignments and some of the other things. But I figured I'd go ahead and start us off. Before I introduce our presenters for this evening, wanted to let you know that the current data just got posted on the juniorsimmental.org link, so you can look that up. I will inform you that some of the data for both January and February, if you haven't looked, in some spots is a little bit rough. You should be aware we've had a pretty substantial amount of weather here at the location that the feed yard is here, right in the middle of Missouri. In fact, we've had north of double the normal snow load for this area. It's caused some challenges on a variety of fronts. Cattle look healthy. I've seen them just in the last couple of days. They're thrifty, they're good. Some of those cattle are struggling through some of the weather that we've dealt with. Might be something that comes up a little later as we go through the evening, but wanted to let you know the data is up there. You might have some challenges or some questions that you'd like to present to me after the fact. Feel free in the coming days after you've had a chance to look at that to reach out to me or reach out to Bailey, and we can communicate on that front. Now, makes sense we're talking about some nutritional aspects that we would have, oh, I don't know, maybe a nutritionist on. And this evening, we have Dr. Derek Brake. Dr. Brake got his PhD at Kansas State, I believe. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. Was at South Dakota State University prior to joining the faculty at the University of Missouri. So he gets to see your calves on a reasonable occasion. So he's fairly familiar with this program on a variety of fronts. So Dr. Brake's going to take the lead and go through, as you can see, some of the fundamentals of feedlot nutrition. I'd encourage you to dig in deep. As you all always know, when we talk some of these things, some of you are past participants, nutrition is a fun but a deep topic. And so you might want to come back and re-listen to this talk multiple times to pick up on some of the nuances. That's great, very appropriate. So with that, I welcome Dr. Brake, and I'm going to be quiet and let him have it.
All right, thanks, Chip. So as Chip mentioned, I'm a nutritionist by training, and I'd like to spend just a little bit of time with you all this evening, just to kind of go over a little bit about what we do and really what the feedlot's all about. And so really we're just going to scratch the surface on a lot of these things. There's a lot more depth on everything, but hopefully by the time the evening's over, we're able to at least hit on a lot of the real key parts of what we like to think about when we're trying to feed and manage cattle in a feedlot setting. So I guess the first thing I always like to ask folks, or when we think about this stuff, is ask the really simple question: is nutrition easy or is it complex? So, and the answers really, it depends on what your objectives are. If your objectives are to feed an animal in a way that it's thrifty, that it gains weight, and that it's happy and healthy, well, nutrition's actually pretty easy. You can achieve those objectives on a whole lot of different diets made up from a whole lot of different ingredients. Where nutrition becomes quite difficult is actually balancing costs associated with feed relative to the performance of the animal. To give an example of this, the gentleman pictured in the lower left-hand portion of this slide, Frank B. Morrison, was a scientist out of the University of Wisconsin and was famous for a book called Feeds and Feeding. In that book, which first started being published in 1917, you can find at least 8 separate rations available for cattle in those diets. And those diets could be fed to cattle today, and we would expect certain degrees of performance. However, the costs of feeding those rations is nearly triple what our current ration costs are if we were to feed those. So that's where nutrition actually becomes relatively more challenging, and money matters, and it matters to us a lot. in the feedlot, and most of the time the nutrition or feeding expenses often account in excess of 80 to 85% of the total feeding costs in the feedlot. This is some data that comes out of 5 separate feedlots in Kansas that's put together by Kansas State. And what this represents is this is monthly closeouts, both returns. So the green bars would be profit and the red bars would be loss. And you can see that there's variability in feeding cattle in the feedlot, especially when it's for profit. And frankly, when you look at if you look at the average of these lines, normally the average is actually below 0. So typically the average is at a loss. Now, that doesn't mean that feedlots lose money. What that means is it means that it takes skill to feed cattle in a way that's economical. So generally, those feedlots with less attention on nutrition and management are often contributing to a greater amount on the loss side to this versus those professional feeders that often do quite well, even in tough conditions. So here's a breakdown of this. What we see on the right here is something that you may or may not be familiar with or have seen at some point in the past, but on the right side of this slide would be a closeout. So this would represent some of the this would be some of the information that we would typically see coming from a feedlot after we close out a lot of cattle. And there's expenses that are expressed both overall or on a per head basis, or most importantly, cost of gain. So, which is a thing that we're going to talk about. I'm going to talk about a couple of times throughout the evening. And frankly, that's what a modern nutritionist spends the majority of their time focused on, is looking for ways to optimize that feed cost to gain. And the reason why nutritionists and consulting nutritionists for large feedlots spend such a large amount of their time focused on optimizing feed cost to gain is because on this pie chart here located on the left-hand side of this slide, you can see that representation where the overall feeding cost is accounted for about roughly, I believe it was in this, that's from this closeout, I think it was about almost 83% of the total costs. And feeding those cattle was all associated with feeding costs. And so, and you can see from this closeout, for this given lot of cattle, this was a pen of, I believe it was 100 head of cattle that was closed out in here. And you can see that there's some relatively large numbers that are being involved in the total lot of cattle. And when this is all widowed down, that worked to this particular lot of cattle lost money. The overall lot itself lost $144.39, and which worked out to $2.63 per head, and on a per weight per 100 pounds of gain. So those feed costs of gains, they lost 21 cents per 100 pounds of gain that were put on the cattle. So and so feed's really, really important when there's a lot of money wrapped up in this business, and we oftentimes are chasing relatively tight margins in adding value to the cattle. So and this shows the relative volatility which cattle and corn markets have changed a lot here in the last 7 days, that are going to invariably influence our feeding costs of gains. That feedlot decision making, the reason why feed cost of gain is discussed at such length is because both feeder cattle or yearlings are often, these are an actively traded commodity. A feedlot operator can look and assign a live market value to an animal, understand what those are traded, and take protections against those by trading contracts to ensure profits or minimize losses. And that's by balancing the feeder a feeder contract versus a fat cattle contract or a live cattle contract, which are both traded on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. And so if you understand what you're going to sell the calf for when it shows up in the feedlot, and you understand what you're going to purchase the calf for, then you know the margin that is effectively that you have available to you in the feedlot sector. And so the only variable that controls how much profit or how much loss you incur is all associated with feed costs of gains. And nutritionists focus on the component of those feed costs of gains, which are completely assigned to the diet or the feed. So what is nutrition? Well, nutrition is a thing not unique to cattle. It's a thing that applies to us as well. You go to your doctor, and your doctor might want to talk to you about diet. This is a thing. These figures that I've put on here are both published by the USDA. A long time ago, there used to be this food pyramid, and we used to talk about, you know, as humans, we should eat this percent of this type of feed or like a carbohydrate, and then so much fruits and meats and a little bit of fats and oils. And recently, or about 10 years ago, it was revised where now a lot of that same data is presented to us as humans. And it's illustrated in this graphic here where we see a plate. But ultimately, nutrition is just balancing each of these different. So when you might talk to your doctor about your own diet, you're going to hear things about grains and dairy and protein and veggies and fruits and things like that. Well, all of those contain unique nutrient components, and really those recommendations are designed to help you balance your diet best so that you can meet your own nutrient requirements for each of those specific nutrients that we find in feed. So when we talk about nutrients, there's actually 6 unique nutrients that make up all foods, and almost every ingredient in a food contains each of these ingredients. It's really rare, or each of these nutrients, it's really rare for any individual feed to not have all of these nutrients in them. So those nutrients are water, carbohydrates, proteins, lipid or fat, and then vitamins and minerals. And what I've done here to go in line with the current USDA graphic for a plate is I've tried to build my own little plate, but I've built a plate for cattle. So if we were to build this plate for cattle and we were trying to visualize these nutrients, we'd actually see that a big part of that plate needs to come from is energy, which actually isn't even listed as one of our nutrients. Then it would be followed in a distant second by protein, and then fiber, which is a fraction of carbohydrates, and then vitamins and minerals would be required in the least amount when we look at these nutrients. So what is energy? Because energy is not in our nutrient categories. Well, energy itself is actually it's an abstraction. It's just a definition it's something that we use to describe as the ability to do work. And we see it all around us. Well, us and cattle and all living things need energy. This is why we talk about this. The most common form of energy that we use when we talk about ourselves is calories up here. So, and we use this big C calorie, but there's all these different forms when we talk about feeding livestock that the amount of energy in the diet can use all these different units, and it really doesn't matter what unit you use, as long as you're using the same one. Normally, a feedlot nutritionist you'll hear, if you talk to a feedlot nutritionist, they'll use terms like, they'll say that's a 64 meg diet, or a 65 meg diet, or a 55 meg diet. What they're referring to in that slang is the net energy available to support growth or gain, and it's in megacals per 100 pounds of feed is normally the reference. So I mentioned that energy doesn't the energy is not listed on any of our 6 nutrients, and that's because it's so important that the body actually has found a way to get energy from half of those nutrients. So carbohydrates, protein, and lipid are all metabolized or burned inside of the body, and they're used to get energy from these that support the work of growth and the work of survival that we care an awful lot about cattle being able to achieve when they're in the feedlot. And so ultimately energy drive, and the reason why the nutritionists use that slang of just describing a ration and nothing but energy requirements is because greater energy intake results in improved feed costs of gain, that thing that nutritionists always think about. So the amount of energy available though to support gain it differs, and that's because there's a hierarchy with which the body uses nutrients or energy for. There's different priorities. So the first thing that the body uses energy for is for maintenance. Maintenance is a term that we use in livestock nutrition and cattle nutrition. It just basically describes that the body wants to do nothing more each day than look the exact same as it did when the day started. And so all of the things required to be successful at that, we group together and we call maintenance, to make sure that the body doesn't lose mass and that it survives and thrives and lives in its environment. There's development, which is associated with growing a new calf, and then there's growth up here in this pyramid that sits on this slide, which really kind of comes in a little bit after development, but it's before lactation, reproduction, and fattening. And this actually makes it a little tricky because we, as feedlot nutritionists, what we're trying to do is we're trying to achieve growth. We also want a certain degree of fattening to occur, which this creates some issues between feeding some, particularly heifers sometimes in the feedlot. So if you remember back to our plate, the next thing after energy was protein. So in livestock nutrition, particularly cattle nutrition, what we do is we use something called crude protein. Well, crude protein just means that we crudely assume that protein contains 16% nitrogen. And so what we actually are measuring is we're measuring the amount of nitrogen that's in the feed when we send off a feed for a laboratory analysis. We take that amount of nitrogen in a feed and we multiply it by 6.25, which is the same value you get when you divide 100 by 16. And that gives us the percent crude protein. So feedlot cattle require at least 12.6% of the ration as crude protein. And so we always formulate rations to contain at least 12.6% crude protein. At times we'll feed over that, but that comes to that tricky part of nutrition. It all depends on the value or the costs associated with feeding the animals. And when there's times when corn is really expensive, protein's relatively inexpensive, or feeds that have high amounts of energy and high amounts of protein, things like wet distillers grains, modified distillers grains, then what can commonly happen is we actually end up overfeeding protein. So now energy and protein themselves are a moving mark, so they aren't always the same. A calf that enters the feedlot doesn't have the same energy and protein requirements as it does when it exits the feedlot. And the reason for that is because energy and protein requirements are based on what we call composition of gain. So in other words, every time an animal grows, it puts down fat or protein. If we roughly say that in the feedlot, that animal's not going to add a lot of skeleton. And that's generally true. It depends on the type and kind of cattle that come into the feedlot most of the times, but generally most skeletal growth has been largely achieved in the animal's life before it enters the feedlot. And so it's relatively accurate for us to assume that every pound of gain that a calf experiences in the feedlot is going to subsist mostly of protein and fat. Well, protein and fat don't have the same amount of energy in them. And so actually fat has almost twice the amount of energy in it than that protein does. And so there's 9.45 calories per gram of fat versus 5.65 calories per gram of protein. And what happens as a calf grows is it goes from a lightweight to nearer to a finish weight. What ends up happening is fat makes up an increasing proportion of the overall gain that animal experiences, and protein decreases up to a final finish weight. And what this does, because there's these changes, that changes the caloric requirement, where we have an increasing requirement for calories and a decreasing requirement for protein when an animal is in the feedlot. And this matters because one thing that we do when we're buying those cattle in a feedlot setting is we like to project out their rates of gain. And we can do that based entirely off of the calories that we think the animal's going to consume. So what drives what calories are consumed is, one is the energy concentration of the ration. The next thing's the amount of feed that the animal's going to eat. And so we care a lot about that. One is formulating the ration in the way that provides protein and energy in the most affordable sense. And then the other is, then once we've achieved that, then a lot of times what we focus on is how do we optimize that animal's ability to consume feed? How can we maximize dry matter intake? Because the more that animal eats, the higher the caloric intake is. And that dilutes out maintenance, the amount of feed that's going to be used to support maintenance, or the unproductive. While that's important for the animal to survive, it's not a fraction of the feed that supports the thing that we get paid for in the feedlot, which is growth or gain. So gain is predicted by energy, but as I've alluded to, the reason for that is because of this increasing rate that fat increases, and what that corresponds with is increasing amounts of overall body fatness as well. And so energy just becomes this really large component of, or contributor to describing performance in the feedlot. And so, this is the same chart that I've shown now a couple of times. But now it has this blue line on top. This blue line is the requirement, or the amount of net energy for gain required in order to support the identical rate of body weight gain. And so you can see that these mega cals per day that are required in net energy for growth actually increase almost 2 times what they are for a lighter weight calf to a calf nearer to finished weight. And that's because body fatness and the amount of gain that's described in fat increase so much. This is part of the reason why a lot of times the most costly period to feed cattle in the feedlot is normally in the last 30 to 45 days in the feedlot, and that's because we're approaching these body masses where most of that gain is described by fat. So the caloric requirements nearly double. So after we formulated our rations for energy and protein, the next part of our plate for cattle is fiber. So fiber is typically the most costly ingredient on a caloric basis that we can feed to cattle, and that's because fiber only contains about 33 to 50% of the amount of calories as grain. And so, why do we feed cattle fiber if energy is the most important component, and that describes performance, and its cost per unit energy is so costly? Why do we feed it? Well, cattle need fiber, specifically what we call as physically effective fibers. This is fiber that we include in the ration that goes into their rumen, the largest compartment of their stomach, and it causes stimulation of growth of some of the structures that are really important to absorbing nutrients from their diet. And so nutritionists call physically effective fiber physically effective NDF, and that's just a fiber, which NDF is a chemical measure that reflects fiber in plants. And so any fiber fraction that's more to 5 to 6 millimeters in length. So not very long. That's millimeters, about the thickness of a fingernail. So about 5 to 6 thicknesses of fingernails on top of one another. That's all the longer the fiber has to be to impart some sort of physically effective fiber. And normally in the feedlot, we balance our rations to contain at least 8% of the diet as physically effective fiber or physically effective NBF. So we limit hay because of its cost, but there's some other issues because we want to limit the amount of hay that we feed in the feedlot. So one is, if you've ever been around a feedlot, you might see something like this that I'll play for just a little bit on this video. Hopefully it comes across here. So what's demonstrated on this video is this is a tub grinder that's grinding hay to reduce its particle size so that it can fit inside, so that the overall ration can have good mixed characteristics and be delivered into a concrete bunk well. And I don't know how well that came across, but at least on my end, what this tub grinder was associated with, there's a couple of things that don't make it a really pleasant job to be near this thing. One, we saw hay blowing all over the place. Hay has a natural affinity in the feedlot to find the grill of a pickup truck and the grill of tractors, and which then means we've got to blow that out with an air compressor. It sticks to about everything, and whatever doesn't end up on the grill of the pickup truck or on the grill of the tractor ends normally up your nose, which isn't a very pleasant experience either. So hay's difficult to deal with outside of it being costly. And the other trick is cattle don't really like it. This is a dairy cow, but she's going to do a great job of demonstrating something for us. So what she just did there, a lot of folks might not pick up real subtly, but as that cow moved her head down along that bunk line, what she's effectively doing is she was sorting her ration. And that changed the diet. Because now all of a sudden she's consumed something that we didn't want her to consume just that way. What she does, cattle sort feed based on density. So how much weight per area is associated with feed inside of there. So normally less dense particles rise in a mixture and more dense particles fall. And this is similar to what, if you've ever seen a show or a movie that demonstrated an old-time gold miner, and they're trying to show this separation of gold from other rocks. Normally there's a pan that's used with water in it, and there's a sifting action that's used, and that's literally sifting out dense gold particles from less dense other metals and rocks that are contained inside or associated with different materials. Cattle don't have an ability to pick through feed like us humans. They don't have an opposable thumb, but they do have this big old muzzle, and they will generally move that back and forth along a bunk line to get out the fractions of feed that they want to eat. And what this ultimately contributes to is it increases the amount of variation, or how the uniformity with which cattle perform on a given diet, which is a thing we often want to try and prevent. So we ask, how can we reduce feed sorting inside of when we feed cattle? So this is a thing we think about. Well, reducing feed sorting is a lot like trying to feed an infant human. So for any of you who might have tried to feed a pretty young person at some point in your life, you know there's a lot of effort that's spent on coming up with a well-balanced diet. And it's normally put into a tray, and we categorize, we put it in these different bins. And at least every time I've been involved with it, it doesn't take too long for that to become a big mottled mess with half of the food all over the place. except for the pudding or the really tasty stuff, that all got eaten, but all the fruits and veggies are now kind of strewn. Some of them were eaten, some of them weren't. And what ultimately this results in a diet that doesn't necessarily match closely what we wanted the child to eat, or in the case of cattle nutrition, what we want the cattle to eat. And so a tool that we have to fight sorting of feed in the feedlot is actually moisture. So generally, the drier the ration, the easier it is for cattle to sort. And so as we increase the amount of moisture in the ration, there's less overall capabilities for sorting and compared to drier diets. So the last thing on our plate was vitamins and minerals for our calf. So vitamins and minerals are most often needed only in very trace amounts, with the exclusion of salt and limestone, which we call macro minerals, because they have we can express their requirement as whole percentages of the diet. Almost all the other minerals are needed in parts per million or parts per billion of the overall diet. So that's a very, very tiny amount. And the body has a capability to store minerals and vitamins to a certain extent inside of the body for a period sufficient to meet requirements in the feedlot. So a lot of times we just feed vitamins and minerals for more of an insurance policy, but they've also become a pretty effective economic tool for a lot of consulting nutritionists, and a lot of times consultancy fees are incorporated into the costs of a vitamin and mineral, which oftentimes make vitamins and minerals on a price per pound basis the most expensive component or ingredient that's purchased to formulate or to be incorporated into rations. So where do rations come from for the most part? Well, rations come from consulting nutritionists, independent consulting nutritionists. They also come from feed additive companies who may or may not employ nutritionists. They also come from local cooperatives, and these all depend normally on the size and scope of the feedlot and the resources they have available to them. So there's another component. So it's very easy to get lost in like, how do we feed cattle? And I've spent some time talking about the absolute nutrient requirements or the chemical components of the diet that cause animals to gain or perform well inside of a feedlot. But there's a whole other component to this, which is effectively management of the cattle as well when we're in the feedlot. So I like to think of how should we feed cattle in a feedlot? Well, we shouldn't feed cattle in an amount that they would like to control their own feed intake. This is some data from Kelly Bruns and Robbie Pritchard from about 20 years ago that you see two lines here. If you look on this graph, that one of these lines is bouncing back and forth and back and forth. And that is cattle that were allowed all the feed that they could handle. And when cattle are given all the feed that they can handle, it's kind of like when I tell somebody that they can eat all the ice cream that they can handle. So it sounds like a great deal to begin with until you eat about a whole gallon of ice cream to yourself, and then you're regretting that decision the next day when you're not feeling so hot. Well, cattle tend to do the same thing. They'll overeat, and then that causes a digestive disturbance, and then they undereat, and that causes some real logistical challenge. The second line on here is actually cattle that were managed for a given amount of feed in the bunk. So where the animals are where we're trying to match the maximum amount of intake, but not give the animals so much that they actually have a digestive upset. And this is similar data as well, where you can see this really bouncing around line. Those are cattle that were allowed all the feed that they could eat versus cattle that were, the amount of feed was offered was controlled, typically through a bunk scoring system, to try and match the amount of feed, but not overfeed the animal. And this is generally done in most commercial feedlots. And that's because we want to remember, we want to maximize that intake, but we want to maximize the intake over the entire feeding period, not on any one day, because that's what gives us better feed conversions and improved feed cost gains. So in order to do that, consistency is key when we feed cattle. So there's a lot of factors that influence the amount a calf wants to eat day over day. So the temperature, differences in timing of feed delivery, the number of times that we deliver feed, whether or not the calf has an implant, whether or not the number of animals in a pen change, because it's about 1.8 to 3% of all calves that enter the feedlot ultimately have to be removed from the pen, either because of illness or death. And then also we do there's times when we reprocess cattle where we implant a calf again, where we weigh it, or we clean its water and do things like that. All of these influence daily intake behavior. And so the problem, when these different factors influence intake, and the calf wants to eat a lot one day, but then it doesn't want to eat a lot the next day, is in part because what happens inside of its stomach, specifically in the rumen, is it can produce something called lactic acid, or experiences something called lactic acidosis, which is production of lactic acid. That's the stuff that, if you've ever exercised really hard, or if you've ran a lot or something and you feel sore the next day, that's what makes your muscles feel sore. And cattle make the same thing, but they can make a whole lot more of it at once than we can. So much so that it actually changes their blood chemistry and can cause some pretty severe illness associated with it. And it results from the animal overeating high amounts of really fermentable feed. And so lactic acidosis actually can contribute to things that impact the value of the carcass, like abscesses in the liver. It reduces our feed intake, which reduces growth. And in severe cases, it can cause diarrhea. It can impact hoof structure and soundness of the calf. And in very severe situations, it can result in death. So we want to manage this, and I've mentioned bunk managing. And so the way we try and manage bunk is we categorize the amount of feed that's left. So what I've put up here is probably the most common bunk scoring system that's used. At the end of the day, it's a bit subjective, but it's based on the amount of feed that's available. So oftentimes we use a zero bunk scoring system, which would represent no feed in a bunk, and actually the bunk itself is licked. What we shoot for is a half of a bunk score. So that's where there's scattered feed. Most of the bunk itself is empty, but basically there's a corn kernel about every 4 to 6 feet along a bunk with about 100 head in it. What that really signals is that we're about right where we need to be, that the cattle aren't so hungry that they're licking the bunk, but they're hungry enough that they eat nearly all of the feed available to them. So scores beyond that represent different amounts of feed that are left in the bunk. And what this is a signal to us that there was some factor that resulted in the calf not wanting to eat as much, which is generally a good signal that we want to start evaluating some of those factors that influence feeding behavior and identify and remedy those as soon as possible so that we can start to allow that calf to increase its overall intake. So, you know, the way I like to think about changing the amount of feed available to a calf day over day is I like to think a lot of it about the way an airliner is controlled. If you've ever ridden on an airplane or gone somewhere, a lot of the times the way hopefully the takeoff is nice, smooth, and a very controlled ascent to a cruising altitude. And then when it's time to land, normally that's a smooth process that occurs as well. It's not a very rapid up and down, up and down, up and down. And so we, based on those bunk scores that I showed you, we generally come up with protocols or rules that we try and follow that help us control from being too reactionary and overfeeding an animal to an extent that it causes a digestive disturbance. So a lot of times what we like to do is only increase the amount of feed available to a calf somewhere between 1/4 to 1/2 pound per head per day once we've achieved a maximum intake. And while we're building intakes, we definitely want to try and avoid feeding much more than 1 pound of dry matter per head per day, because this can result in those instances that result in that lactic acidosis. We also try and pay attention in the feedlot when we're feeding, not only the score of the bunk, but we also need to account if we're not going to clean the bunk, which doesn't necessarily need to be done unless something's happened to cause the feed to spoil in most rations. Typically, feed will remain good in a bunk for 1 to 2 days after it's been fed. And so a lot of times what most feedlot managers will do is try to adjust the feed call to ensure that those animals will consume all the feed that's been offered that day, but also the feed that was left in the bunk. And if you fail to account for bunk inventory, even though you might correct the problem and get intakes to return, you'll continue to think that the animals are refusing feed, which isn't the case. You're just seeing the refusal from before. So, and then one of the last another consideration we like to think about is when do cattle eat. So cattle actually have multiple meals in the feedlot, but they focus those meals at different times of the day. So this is two lines that reflect feeding behavior, the amount of animals that were up at a bunk in a feedlot, and it's plotted across times of the day. And you can see here we have 2 peaks. There's both a large peak where most of the cattle came up to eat sometime in the morning, and then sometime later in the afternoon. So cattle themselves are prey species, and even though humans have managed cattle now for many, many years, what we haven't bred out of the animal is this natural prey-like behavior. So a prey species is an animal that gets eaten by other animals. And so what became an innate characteristic or a characteristic natural to cattle is they generally like to go focus their meals when the sun's rising and oftentimes when the sun's setting. What advantage this gives them in a wild setting is that most predators or animals that eat prey species have the ability to either see really well or hunt really well in the daytime or hunt really well in the nighttime. But very, very few predators are very good at hunting in those transition times when the sun's rising and when the sun's setting. And so most prey species like cattle will focus those times of the day to come out from cover and focus on eating their meals. We see this behavior still today in the feedlot. And so understanding when cattle eat is really critical, because this is what helps us understand when we should try and deliver the feed so that we can maximize intake and control the factors that change the amount that animal would eat from one day to the next. So the last prepared slide that I have for us this evening is actually a picture of the feedlot where all of your cattle are located. So we have most of the common forms of housing available to us at the Beef Research and Teaching Farm at the University of Missouri. Your cattle are currently located in our pens that most closely reflect pens that we would find in most corporate or large feedlots. So these are earthen bottom pens constructed with mounds, and they have shade and cover. We also have smaller pens that are have concrete bottoms, which would be more typical of the types of pens we'd use in a nutrition research experiment. And we also, in the distance over here towards this big television antenna, is we also have barns, which have string pens in them, which provide cover for about 50%, 40% of the overall pen area, and 60% of that pen area is exposed to the weather, and cattle can move in and out. And so those type of housing systems might be more akin or more typical of some of the smaller feeding operations that you may see normally throughout the Corn Belt, places like Iowa and Illinois. But most of the feedlots, particularly the larger feedlots that we'd see in western Kansas, Oklahoma, Panhandle of Texas, and eastern Colorado would be constructed much like this, and so and that creates at times some challenges, which frankly we've experienced as we went throughout the winter. That's resulted sometimes in areas where we get winter weather, but not oftentimes enough cold to cause a real hard freeze on the ground. It can contribute to mud accumulation, which can increase those maintenance energy expenditures associated with calves, and sometimes do less than desirable things to some of our feed conversions. But oftentimes the reason that we feed cattle in these larger settings is because it allows for more uniform management, and it results in the most optimal balance of the value of gain in the calf relative to the cost of construction of the pen, which is why you see it in the really large feedlots that we see in various parts of the United States. So with that, that's all I had as far as slide presentations. I don't know if there's any questions or if there's an easy way to do that.
Yep, there is. You don't even have to worry about it. I'll take care of that for you. So SPC participants, as always, if you have questions or comments or would like to pull on a thread a little bit farther with Dr. Brake, who, by the way, for those of you who are looking on the computer, has the distinct misfortune of having my name under his picture. And so I feel bad for those of you, and in particular for him. So you know how to send those questions in if you have them. So in the meantime, while they're coming in, a couple comments, and then I'm gonna ask a question or two as well that's came my way. Dr. Brake has done, we have a lot of nutritionists join us through the years. Every year we have this, as many of you know. But I think Dr. Brake has done really one of the more impressive jobs of probably putting some pieces in here that some of our college age and high school age folks are going, hey, that's intriguing. I got to dig at that a little bit more, but also trying to resonate with some of our younger audience and make this enjoyable and informative. So I say thank you. That's not an easy task to do, to meet that wide range. And so thank you. I got a couple quick questions, and then we'll see where this goes. Something very early in the conversation, Dr. Brake, you mentioned in one of your very first slides, you highlighted how difficult and how challenging it can be to find profit in this space. And then shortly thereafter, you referenced this thing that we call the board and contracts. You're not an economist or a risk management person. We'll probably have that person in the future. But could you just briefly kind of square the circle for me a little bit on how we're ensuring a little more profitability using those things, just on a big 30,000 foot view?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question, Chip. What is commonly traded is what we call futures contracts. So what that represents is we can effectively lock in the value with which we're able to sell an animal for at the time of its purchase. And we can do that by buying a piece of paper that's actively traded that represents all cattle that will be purchased or sold at a given contract month into the future. That that's thought to closely reflect the cash price that we could recognize at some point in the future, and it provides us a certain degree of insurance, if you will. Particularly, you can trade these things much like you can trade stocks, and there's people who do that. But for those of us involved in the cattle feeding business, what we have the opportunity to do is when we actually have ownership of the calf, irrespective of what happens to the relative value of that contract as time moves on, at the time we acquire that contract, what we're effectively agreeing to, because we will sell a calf eventually at the termination of that, is we're guaranteeing that I find this price to be acceptable. And they give us parameters which help us reduce some of the risk associated with things, which quite honestly we are seeing right now in the cattle industry. In the last, for those of us who are keeping up with some of the events that are going on at a global scale in the news, there's been some things that have happened over in Europe that have caused corn prices to become quite volatile over the last 5 or 6 days, and fat cattle prices to a lesser extent. And so one of the ways we can control those things is by those contracts. But what might help us decide whether or not we want to execute a contract to provide that degree of insurance would be how much cost we think is going to be involved in the production of that. And so that's why that feed cost of gain becomes so critical, and that's why nutritionists become so integral towards the successful operation of a lot of feedlots.
So that very slim space that you just described in that decision making from that risk management component, that's a whole discipline in and of itself. And we won't go too far. We won't go any farther on that one unless some person asks to. But suffice it to say, the modern feeding business would not function without those risk management tools as we know it. Is that safe to say?
Oh, absolutely. In most large feedlots, there's at least one person, if not many people, that are employed by the feedlot. And for cattle that are owned by the feedlot, because most feedlots, the animals in a feedlot typically represent some sort of mixture of cattle either owned by the feedlot itself, or they represent cattle owned by some other person that are being fed on a fee-based structure. Well, cattle that are actively owned by most large feedlots, these companies employ people who may or may not trade those pieces of paper to ensure a degree of risk or ensure a degree of profit, rather. Those animals oftentimes may be traded 100 times from the time they come into the feedlot to the time they exit the feedlot, with the goal of actually just trying to maximize the value per head on each one of those animals. So it's, yes, you're absolutely correct. The modern feeding industry is not, would look nothing like it does without those in place.
And my last comment on that will be, it's not totally dissimilar from what some of your families now have at their disposal. There are some financial tools that attempt to predict rainfall and precipitation and allow producers to bring in some dollars in certain situations. And so in the same way that those tools can add flexibility and opportunity to those of us at the production level, these are, again, not exactly the same tools, but some similar premises to give these folks some level of insurance, as Dr. Brake says. Dr. Brake, Jenna Doherty has a question, and her question is, do cattle grow better indoors or out of doors, and do they have a preference?
That's a great question, Jenna. There's some data available on that, and the cattle normally housed indoors will have about a 3 to 4% improvement in their feed costs of gain, which is normally mostly explained by increased rates of gain. As we What we don't see a lot of difference in is actually when we move cattle outside, if they're provided some degree of shelter, like a roof over their head, we can't separate the differences between completely enclosed systems and open systems as long as there's roofing over top of the animal. Where we do see a slight drop in performance are pens that are provided no cover, so where the animal's exposed to all the elements all the time. The preference is an interesting one, and it's one that a lot of folks spend a lot of time thinking about. Cattle will prefer to have access to open air environments and exit a barn if given the option. But they also like to not stand in direct sunlight on a warm summer day or stand on top of a hill with a cold north wind blowing on them. And so there's some things we do in larger earthen bottom pens often to help provide opportunity for that. Most what we can't see in this picture is a lot of times what we do is we try and build mounds within those pens, and cattle can locate themselves on either side of a mound to help get outside of wind and cold conditions. And simultaneously, we also give them some roof structure as well to give them that. But typically in a barn, we will see a slight, about, like I said, about a 3 to 4% improvement in rate of gain. That we really can't separate from those open pens with shelter, but if they are completely exposed, we can generally detect that. Now, you might ask the question, why then do we build? Because different from the picture that I'm showing you right now is a lot of the large feedlots in this country will have earthen bottom pens with no covering on them at all. And the reason for that is even though they're slightly lower performance typically in those environments, the cost of manufacturing and maintaining the pen is considerably less, and it would require the feedlot to capture lots of value back per pound of feed in order to capture value on those expenses to see a 3 or 4% improvement in rate of gain. So hope I answered your question.
Very good. Jen, I bet he did, but if you have a follow-up, please ask it. An additional question, you mentioned we often talk, when we talk about carcass value, we talk about pounds, carcass weight, we talk about quality grade, yield grade, and any sort of big problems, right? And those will be things we'll talk about in coming months, and those are going to identify carcass value. But you also mentioned something that's a really significant deal for a packer to be able to actually turn a profit. They're looking at some of these products that are sometimes not skeletal muscle, right? And you mentioned one in particular, livers. Liver abscesses tend to be a remarkably big problem, in particular in dairy influenced cattle. Any speculation as to why those dairy cattle would have a slightly higher incidence of liver abscess than maybe some of our native beef?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. You know, Holsteins are different than most of our beef breeds, largely in their capacity that they eat more. Most Holsteins generally have a higher compensatory for their ability, or a higher ability to eat more feed. They actually grow at the same rate, and because of that, they have a lower feed conversion, or a poorer feed conversion, and greater feed costs of gains. But their ability to eat a larger volume of feed, a lot of times that probably contributes to increased incidences of acidosis, which I mentioned in this presentation briefly. Well, a consequence of acidosis is that it can actually damage the lining of the rumen, or the stomach, and that allows some bacteria that are natural and found inside the rumen to escape into the blood, where they go into the liver. And when they make it to the liver, they like it there an awful lot, and they want to ferment some of the protein that it consists in those liver, and they, for lack of a better term, effectively aggregate in there and make a large pimple. And that's effectively what a liver abscess is, but within the body. And so part of the reason that we probably see a greater incidence of that liver abscess in the Holstein animals, probably because of their greater propensity to intake intake of a highly fermentable ration. And some feedlots actually specialize in trying to manage Holstein and dairy influenced animals. And there's oftentimes some steps that are taken to try and control intake of the ration. Generally, you might see a higher fiber component in Holstein rations, in part to help limit the rate at which they'll eat some of those finishing rations that we often give them.
Very good. Again, I'm going to encourage here in just a moment. We're going to turn this over to Miss Abel, and she's going to talk to you about your assignments. But before we do that, I think you gathered, maybe even in that very last response, how holistic some of these concepts are, right? In terms of how what might perceive to somebody like myself who's not a nutritionist, a small change in a diet can have such drastic impact. And so some of you, especially older students who are thinking about career changes and what comes next, the genre of nutrition is one that's tremendously exciting. There's loads of opportunities professionally and academically. And so I'm going to guess that if you have that kind of passion and you'd have an interest, you're probably pretty resourceful. So you could probably find Dr. Derek Brake on the University of Missouri Animal Science website, and I'd bet he'd be eager to entertain any questions or follow-ups that you might have. So Dr. Brake, I say thank you a bunch. I appreciate you taking the time with us this evening.
I appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity. So, cool. And yeah, if there's any questions, feel free to reach out. I'm more than happy to help.
Very good. Bailey, I'm going to be quiet and turn this over to you.
Okay, that. Thank you very much. And Dr. Brake, are you still on?
I am. I think I just shut off my webcam.
No, that was just fine. I just wanted to make sure. I had one more quick question for you before I introduce the assignment. And some of the participants might want to pay attention because this can pertain to their assignment if they choose this option. But you mentioned earlier that it takes skill to feed animals economically. And so one of the assignments that these kids are going to have the option to do talks a little bit about byproducts and some of the unique products that we can feed these animals because they have a unique gut that can handle more things than some animals. And so can you take just a minute to discuss how some of those byproducts play a role in feeding these animals? And then also, compared to your first slide, how much of what we feed now might have then either not been a feed item or being considered just a byproduct, but now plays a significant role in that economic importance?
Sure. So to answer your question, byproducts are absolutely, I can turn my webcam back on here so the thing will let me. Byproducts play an integral role in that because really the cattle, I'll throw a $50 term at you. Sometimes we call them their ecological niche. That's a $50 term to say how something fits within its environment. And the real reason as humans, where we capture increased sustenance from beef cattle is their ability to take things that we can't digest and convert them into a highly nutritious, pretty rewarding, satisfying product to eat, which is beef. And we do that pretty well in this country. But cattle end up, especially in the feedlot, actually acting as a large bioreactor to an extent. We oftentimes try and capture value from things that have little value to non-ruminant animals. And so we byproducts or co-products, which are manufactured from various food manufacturing or ethanol production types of systems, things like, a staple of the modern feedlot ration nowadays is to have dry distillers grain, well, not necessarily dry, but a form of distillers grains, which is a byproduct or a co-product of ethanol production. which is oftentimes made from corn. And the purpose of making ethanol is to help give us some fuel for our cars. And this distiller's grains just represents all the parts of the corn that didn't get converted to ethanol. And it's normally has a lot of protein and it has a lot of fiber, and neither of which are really digestible to a human or to a pig or a chicken really, as well as they are to a cow or calf. And so the modern ration is literally the name of the game in the feedlot, is figuring out ways to take these different waste streams effectively from other manufacturing processes and capture value in a ration to cattle. The older rations that I mentioned by Dr. Morrison used to follow what I like to think of as what you might hear some people in the feeding industry, cattle feeding industry, refer to what they call a John Deere diet. And a John Deere diet's nothing more than it was corn and alfalfa that cattle used to be raised on a lot, and so that gives you the green and yellow colors that are hallmarks of John Deere tractors. Those ingredients have a lot of value to a lot of other animals and in a lot of other ways. And so to continue to feed those rations, it puts you in competition with some other industries that can frankly afford to pay more for those than we do nowadays, because we can capture more value from things that they can't. And so byproducts or co-products are an absolute staple of what we try and use in the feedlot.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. So now, participants, I'm going to pull up my screen. Chip, you might have to help me with this.
Yep, I'm not sure which American cemetery you are, so I'm gonna try one. Could go to Kathy, so if it goes to Kathy first, I'll try the next one.
Not seeing anything, or
No.
there we go.
You're good? It's still showing me.
There you go. You see it on your end now? Can you still hear me?
Yes, you're good.
Okay, sorry, it had a glitch on my end for a minute. Okay, so participants, before we get into the assignment for this month, I do want to mention real quick, please make sure that you are remembering that these assignments are required. Webinar attendance is required, and you must watch the webinars within a week of those webinars being posted. So we give you from Tuesday to Tuesday to watch those. And I will say that this group of participants has been absolutely stellar in their assignments. Some of these assignments that we've gotten have, to be honest, just kind of knocked our socks off. So kudos to you all on that. Sadly, on the flip side, this might be the group in my involvement thus far that has also had the poorest rate of turning their assignments in on time and watching those webinars on time. So please make sure that you remember those required, and that we have the ability to pull the data that is on your calves and not make that visible to you all if you all cannot complete your end of the bargain with these assignments. So with that, let's get into what this month holds. So we have 3 different options again this month. And so the first one is one that the participants last year really enjoyed. I think it's a really fun one, and it's one that we get to see a lot about you all in particular. So what you all are going to have the option of doing is designing your own ration. This can be a granola bar, a smoothie, a taco, anything that is a mix. You can design this into something that you would eat. So you're going to base it off your own animal's diet. We've rounded the percentages for you to make it a little bit simpler. You'll see on the bottom of that assignment page is your cattle breakdown, what they're eating in their diet right now. And just so you all know, for some reason this saved a bit funny, that is the complete the complete chart there. There's not a bottom line on that bottom one. I apologize. But that is the ration breakdown that you will follow to mimic your own ration off of. So that one is a fun one. And then with that, there's just a handful of questions that we'll ask you to answer, and make sure you submit either pictures or video documenting what you did, or a very detailed recipe, et cetera, et cetera. You all can read those and you know what we require this far in. Your second option is going to be an essay assignment based on what we just talked a little bit about with the byproducts. And so you're going to have a chance to explore some byproducts that might be specific to your area, and go through and see how might those be useful to animals like your calves in the feedlot. And again, that describes some more in-depth of questions that you might dive into, and we give some sources there that will help you find some of that byproduct information. And then lastly, this is geared a bit more towards the intermediates and seniors. But if there is something from this webinar that really intrigued you, Dr. Brake covered a lot. And as Chip mentioned, did a very good job of both targeting some of the older participants as well as making it accessible to the younger ones. If there is a topic, a subject, a slide that you either found really intriguing, it piqued your interest, or was something you'd not heard before, you are welcome to write an essay over it. Your intermediates, that must be 1,000 words, seniors 1,250. And with that, just note that the webinar obviously will be your main source, but we expect one additional source, and those must be cited. And that option C, you will not see specifically listed on the rubric that gets sent out, but that length requirement is right there in that description. Everything else is the same. So with that, that's all I have for the assignment. Is there anything else that you need to tell them, Chip?
No, I just say thank you. We appreciate everybody. I echo one thing from Bailey Abel's comments, that in the very near future, those who are behind on assignments, your animals will not be viewable through the data sheet. Again, they're still your animals, you still own them, all those things, but you have to keep up on the assignments to be able to keep up on the status of the data. So that's part of the deal that we all agreed to at the beginning. So with that, I'm good. I say again, thank you to everybody. Thank you to Dr. Brake. Ms. Abel, any last thing?
I don't have anything else for him this evening.
Okay, thank you all very much. Have a great night.
Thank you all.